Intro one, intro one. Intro one, intro one. Intro one, intro one.
I want to smoke a cigarette before we get going. That's all right. Fucking freezing here.
Does anyone else have an incredibly difficult time deciphering? Like, I know that the top option on Zoom is microphone and the bottom is speaker, but I promise you every time I mistake speaker for speaker.
The subject of enunciation.
That's right. And every time I'm like, wait a minute, which one do I want? And then I click the wrong one. And then you've got your microphone as your speaker. So like I'm trying to hear out of my own microphone. And then I'm speaking out of my headphones.
Yeah, talking out your own
Usually I'm
ass.
just talking out my ass, yeah.
Exactly.
Jake, it's weird that your microphone is squarely pointed at your anus right now.
Will, how did you break your microphone? I spent the evening in the ER, okay? I'll just put it
No,
that
it's
way.
different. No, my microphone's different. It doubles as some sort of phallic insert.
Sex toy.
That's I actually have an ASMR podcast where I just stick a microphone up my ass.
Wait,
It's called ASSMR.
very good. Very good.
that was that.
Also, like another thing is like the way that like the discourse around like trauma works these days is also heavily ideologically mediated, and like everyone has the kind of trades in trauma, etc.
Mm-hmm.
I've actually noticed that young people who I expect to be, although I hear them using the word a lot. But the young people have actually now, I think, become like, even Gen Zers are like, they use trauma ironically now.
Yeah,
like they
Some
say
of them
trauma
do, yeah.
ironic. Yeah, because it the oversaturation of the term.
It's kind of a
and the
millennial
word.
thing, actually.
Yeah, we're the generation of trauma.
Yeah.
Ugh, for fuck's sake, yeah.
But yeah, like maybe
bored
that's
and
also part of the
jobless
reason
and
I find it like a kind of unethical topic is because of that. But yeah, again, I'm sure there's some reasons that I'm unaware of, but also aware of.
Well, the subject of trauma in Zizek's work is more oriented around the notion of a symptom. And obviously that's there in Freud, but like the symptom as an actual thing, either a material thing or like a symbolic thing.
Mm-hmm. And it's not so much like a matter of memory per se, as it is how an event or something of that nature figures in the symbolic order.
Yeah, like a sublime object.
I was just about to say, like, it's so interesting that for you, like, at least just because the way that you've, I guess, recalled that or recounted that or stated that, Will, was that like for Zizek, trauma is like quite linguistic. Like it's like quite so it's what you read. It's what we're given in the symbolic order that denotes a certain kind of void or
like the
negative.
real brain of trauma, I think you can say.
Mm-hmm.
And the
Yeah,
real
the encounter with interpretation.
Yes. Ooh.
And yeah, so like it's less about like, as we would regularly think of it, as like kind of uncovering some sort of latent moment from one's past, as it is
it's how it's repeated, right? And that's the subject of this quite amazing essay that we've read for today, remembering, repeating, and working through, because
by Freud.
It's a short 10-pager. You can read it if you want before you listen to the episode, or we'll give you the best hits from it. But it's about this, it's about like, how does psychoanalysis interpret the symptom and interpret trauma? And he's going back to the there are kind of three stages of this that Freud works through. There's the first, which is kind of what we've been touching on here, which is remembering, which is, I think, in the kind of conventional notion as to what the sort of like terrain of psychoanalysis is that it's dredging up memories from the past, memories that are still acting upon the subject of analysis, but have been in some way forgotten or covered over.
Yeah, like one's failure to remember something is indicative
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
a traumatic event. Yeah.
So like initially there seemed to be this issue of not remembering, and their way of sort of cutting through that was hypnosis. And so then
Yeah,
they discarded hypnosis and went to free associations.
Jake, penis, go.
Microphone.
Microphone in ass.
They went to free associations to determine what the patient was failing to remember. And Freud says for the analyst, this involved interpretation and communication of its results to the patient and sort of overcoming their resistance to remembering. The goal of these various techniques, Freud says, has of course remained the same throughout in descriptive terms, to fill the gaps in the patient's memory, but in dynamic terms, to overcome the resistances brought about by repression. He goes into a discussion of remembering, the forgetting of impressions and scenes and experiences that the patient never fails to say, "I've always known that. Really, I've just never thought about it." And something that he says something that
people also have that response to philosophy a lot of the time, don't you think? When you're trying to communicate ideas, people are always like, "Oh yeah," I mean, like it always seems obvious to them.
Peter, that is such a cool point. Sorry, that I love that. Like I remember even the sort of the mesmerizing thing about philosophy is about being able to kind of like present you something that you always already knew, and it feels as though there's an unconscious stream in philosophy, right? That there's a way of articulating something that's embedded, that's unknown to you. It's the unknown knowns, right? Or is it or the known unknowns? Either
like
way,
platonic remembering, right?
Exactly, because Plato does say that about the way that he figures in the soul, right? Is that where you have the ability to know things that we ourselves haven't actually. Michael, are you able to explain platonic remembering? Because it's been a long time for me.
It was along the lines you just said, yeah.
It's like the eternity, the eternalness of the soul is proven by our knowing things that we ourselves.
Yeah, I think the soul
can like demonstrate.
Yes, yeah, like
by way of dismissal. People often treat like if they hear some sort of novel philosophical idea. I mean, one should always know when to shut the fuck up when it comes to talking about philosophy, and that's where people who are into philosophy often make mistakes. But like, say it's a conducive conversation, I find often the response of discussing philosophy is that it feels obvious and strikes a person who isn't involved in that like type of discourse as dismissible, kind of because it's obvious.
Mm-hmm. Well, Freud points out that like it's not purely a matter of forgetting what you remembered, because the temporality of that is just something occurred in your past and you're still dealing with the consequences. And I think that's kind of the conventional notion of trauma. But he goes on to point out that there's a whole group of psychic processes which, as purely internal acts, can be contrasted to impressions and experiences. That is, fantasies, relationary processes, emotional impulses, thought connections, and these need to be considered separately as regards their relationship to forgetting and remembering. So this is where he brings up that in this later stage, this middle stage after remembering is what he calls repetition. And remembering comes to be replaced by this concept of repetition. One more quote here. He says that we may say that the patient does not remember anything at all of what he's forgotten and repressed, but rather acts it out. He reproduces it not as a memory, but as an action. He repeats it without, of course, being aware of the fact that he is repeating it.
Right. And one of the terms for that is abreaction.
And repetition compulsion comes out of this notion. This essay is, I believe, from 1914, and his essay on repetition compulsion is from 1920. But this is kind of an early example of that, where like you're kind of caught in this cycle of reenacting your trauma via action rather than a memory, as you just example. But it also has deeply something to do with the death drive, does it not?
Yeah, that's what we discussed, right?
Mm-hmm.
What's the connection there?
Well, that there's like an unconscious direction of your action that is...
It's action, I guess, founded on repetition, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the compulsion to repeat that like transcends the pleasure principle, right, toward pain.
This is not in this essay, but it's a nice little piece from Freud. Is something like when you remember, you're not remembering, you're re-remembering. You're in a sense
Right.
kind of remembering the last time you remembered it.
Yeah.
Ah,
So
interesting.
that's like one of the more like poetic sort of inroads to this idea. Like if you have something that's, more relatable, like an ex-partner or something that you still hold a flame for, each time that you remember them, your mode of remembering distorts them. So like the most romantic thing you can do is to try and not remember them at all, because it keeps them as true to you as they could possibly be.
Good thing I've never experienced whatever, anything that you're talking about. Shout out to all the exes. What's up? I know you're listening.
But it's
just-
a cool idea, because it's not that you're just remembering a past trauma, like we've said. Freud is talking about how that trauma, that symptom, is translated into the present through the form of the repetition of the, like, for instance, defiance of authority in youth is repeated as defiance of treatment. And instead of remembering shame about certain sexual activities, it's repeated as shame regarding treatment.
Interesting. But both of those are in relation to treatment.
Right. Well, this is kind
yeah.
of what the essay is about, right? It's like, how is one to approach an adolescent's trauma?
To expand it, it will be more like it's about transference in general.
Yes, exactly. Because there's it's obviously very important that this essay is about, like, is localized in the relationship between the analyst and the analyst. When we consider it, when we consider trauma, we can, like, I think the commonplace notion of trauma is that it's something that's experienced all the time, very much outside of the analyst's office, and that it's something that we are able to articulate and speak to, and
as if we can be knowing
understand our
subjects
own
of our own trauma.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's
Yeah,
right.
Which
Well,
is
that's right.
Really against
But
this whole notion, because you, on some level, you're obviously unable to recognize your trauma in a direct sense, which
Right.
is why you act it out rather than
Exactly.
Yeah.
In fact, your trauma is the stuff that you are doomed to repeat, right? But in a certain way, I think the contemporary notion, and like, I don't want to be but like the pedestrian notion, the notion, the conversational and rhetorical notions of trauma still have a relationship to what I think it means originally, is because there's something definitive about it, right?
Uh-huh.
We identify with trauma now. We use it as an identity. My trauma makes me.
Yeah.
But ultimately, Freud, the drive, the death drive, as Peter mentioned, like, the death drive is definitively the thing that repeats, is not goal oriented, but repeats almost in this kind of pathological way, to continue itself, right? The drive's activity is to keep the drive itself. And that's the way repetition is not, in fact, a working through. Repetition is the way in which there's an impasse, right?
Yeah.
Whereas the working through goes on in analysis.
Freud does say in this essay that the beginning of treatment is just such a repetition. Like, treatment itself is a kind of repetition. I think that's very interesting. I don't know.
Also, he mentions that people often don't know what to say when they first start, right? Because it's not on the level of speech at that point. It's on the level of action.
Yeah, and I think the point that he's making is that for a lot of people, the repetition is standing in, the remembering is standing in for the repetition, rather than, like, in treatment, it's pointing out that the repetition is the way that, like, in the treatment, repetition replaces memory. But I think in the everyday sense, we mistake the repetition for it as the remembering, as like the being fully cognizant of the causes of one's own trauma, where Freud is showing that now in the present, the trauma is repeated without the subject being fully aware of it. I think
It's interesting also what people, in that sense, to what Jake was saying, in terms of, like, identifying some sort of positive notion of trauma that one can point to as existing in one's past. It's also interesting, like, I'm sure there's plenty you could draw out of, like, what is in someone's choice to draw from a specific example of trauma. Like, there's also some psychic maneuver or tactic in choosing, in like
identifying.
Identifying with a chosen trauma. Yeah.
Well, that's why, like, so Zizek says, if the Freudian name for the unknown knowns is the unconscious, then the Freudian name for the if the Freudian name for the unknown knowns is the unconscious, the Freudian name for the unknown unknowns is trauma.
Whoa.
Wow. That's great.
See, you see, I would think you would think that the formulation would be in reverse.
Yeah. You think it'd be known unknowns, right?
Yeah, and so it's interesting is that the way that I see that is that there's actually a kind of a causality, like that trauma forms the unconscious, and the unconscious is the drive, right? Like, so trauma, these sort of inarticulable events that damage cut right through to the ego and lodge themselves in the body, in the body. Freud speaks about trauma as something that's actually like it passes a sort of defense that we have, which is the ego, and registers in this real core of us. And it's interesting to think of trauma as being the unknown knowns that then sort of manufacture the known unknowns, or rather, excuse me, what is it?
The unknown knowns. They are the unknown
knowns. Yeah. So it's like that the unconscious is the drive, is the register of the drive. And it sort of we bespeak it in a way kind of not controls us, but like it's an ultimate kind of arbiter, but it is informed by the traumatic events, which are the things that we cannot access, right? Because the unconscious is what we access through slips and analysis, and it provides us our symptoms, but it never presents the traumatic event. We are unfortunately only doomed to repeat the traumatic event. We can never actually the traumatic event remains unlocatable and
It's in the mode of repetition that trauma emerges.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So there's not something inherent to an event that is traumatic. It's that when it's rendered, it curves the symbolic space.
Yeah.
As
So
a
like,
trauma.
the unconscious is, the symbolic order in a sense, and the unknown unknowns, what disturbs that order, reframes it in some subtle way, is the trauma.
And Freud does say that like during treatment,
event,
the patient uses the arsenal of the past to arm himself with weapons to fight against the continuation of treatment, weapons that we have to wrest from him one by one. Which made me think of I was rewatching the first few episodes of The Sopranos recently, and it's a fairly parochial representation of analytic treatment in that show, but there is a nice part where Tony Soprano fixes Dr. Melfi's car without her knowing it.
Yeah.
And this made me think, this quote from Freud I just read made me think that in fixing her car, he's not acting out of his own apparent generosity, his self-transparent notion of his own generosity. But he's actually defending himself against treatment by reverting to one of his old tricks of asserting his own power.
Interesting interpretation. That's
cool.
cool.
And so she's very right to, as she does in the show, to rebuff this favor of his. To say it's very inappropriate for him to do that.
Well, yeah, it increases in the program as well, right? Like he starts bringing her flowers. He tries to invite her out on dates, constantly trying to overcome whatever the gap is, which is, the model of transference.
Trying to tame it within your everyday experience to make the analysts something other than that kind of direct relationship, right?
Yeah, right. Which is why it's such a gross transgression to for an analyst or for an analyst, and to kind of posture like the other in the case of analysis is just like anyone else, and that you can kind of relate to them as you would, a lover or whomever you have a certain level of articulable control and knowability. And the gap is so important because then the analyst can function as, transference is the gap that needs to be maintained for the analyst to really be anything and anyone, in order to be that canvas onto which you project all of your and repeat all of your traumatic relationships, or the ways in which trauma informs your relationship.
Tony thinks he's overcoming his selfishness and his desire to be in control of the situation by sort of giving that up and just helping someone, right? But what he doesn't understand is that he's actually just repeating his symptom, his self-aggrandizement of being able to break the bounds of conventional society, to kind of live outside the law, whatever.
Yeah, it's the acting out, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Nice.
Mm-hmm. Damn.
Sorry.
I'm gonna go into I'm gonna go into therapy today with
You got some good shit.
fully loaded.
Army of the chief.
What's up, baby? Yeah, come on, Jordan, let's go.
Let me take this moment to say welcome to Zizek and so on. Jake, Mike, Will, Peter. We got a Patreon. Join for extra episodes. We had a good one last time. What was it on again? Gifts or something like that. I always forget.
That's so funny. Well, it was on the empty gesture, but
Empty gesture. We
so
talked
yes,
about gifts.
the giving of a gift. I mean, that literally there was one line, and Michael said it's kind of like the dare to giving of gifts. But yeah, it was on the empty gesture and on
and to hear us talk about it when we remembered what we were talking about, subscribe to the Patreon.
That's right.
I want to emphasize that one more time. That repeating has this kind of fundamentally different temporality than remembering. This made me think of the note. Like, it's a bit trite. I think it's very like I went to university example, but the Proustian moment, right? Like, the thing that's interesting about that is it's not just a memory, right? The Proustian moment is when the subject's immediate life world disintegrates entirely, where the symbolic slides and becomes immediately reoriented around a little excremental piece of the real, and like a sublime object, I think you can call it. The object returns the past in this little insignificant thing. Like, it's an encounter with kind of the past of the subject as such, not just like sort of remembering the past, which is why I think remembrance is an interesting term there. It has like that kind of, it's like the presence.
Yeah.
Which is why the title of the book is Remembrance of Things Past, right? Or I mean, that's one of the titles. And I think if for anyone, speaking of, once you graduate university, you may encounter W.G. Sebald, and you may encounter, who's our boy, who wrote Mein Kampf?
Nausgaard.
Yeah, I was waiting for you guys to say Hitler.
Our boy Hitler.
who's our boy who wrote Mein Kampf? And I was waiting for one of you smart asses to say Hitler. No,
Jake, that was,
the Scandinavian dude. But in that way, that too, right? Like, especially with Sebald, the way in which an object or a kind of minute, experience can kind of open up I'm trying to think of it, like, a lack of a better word.
Yeah,
it's the presence of the past.
Well, this is the paradox of a symptom or the return of the repressed. It doesn't come from the past; it returns from the future.
Yes.
Yeah, very nice.
Yes, you've always understood this, I think, better than the rest of us, Michael.
Yeah.
Is the notion, the temporality for Lacan, that the future, or that the past is in a way always futured, and like, because it comes from. Because is that because the past is? What's the difference? What is
the past is open, and it's say for example, if it's in the relationship between an analyst and an analysand, whatever it is that gets highlighted or identified as a traumatic event, it's in that present moment, in transference and in interpretation, that its traumaticness is revealed.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
But is that? But where's the future? Because you pull. Yeah, exactly. Because it's not a projection into the future. You don't make your future by determining what your trauma is in the open past. No.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's out of an uneasiness of how your past bears upon your future.
I don't think it's that simple.
No. Okay.
No, and it's not as if that's not a simple concept. Like, we take for granted that that's a simple concept, but I think for Lacan, isn't it that, like, how is it that the past is future?
So, like, the one of the key examples for Zizek is the Wolfman case, right, with Freud. So Zizek says, this is quite long, so we can cut it where it needs to be. The cause is real, the presupposed reef which resists symbolization and disturbs the course of its automaton. Yet the cause is simultaneously the retroactive product of its own effects. In the case of the Wolfman, Freud's most famous patient, the cause, of course, was the traumatic scene of the parental coitus a tergo. The scene was the non-symbolizable kernel around which all later successive symbolization whirled. This cause, however, not only exerted its efficiency after a certain time lag, it literally became trauma. That is, cause through delay. When the Wolfman at age 2 witnessed the coitus ergo, nothing traumatic marked this scene. The scene acquired traumatic features only in retrospect. With the later development of the child's infantile sexual theories, when it became impossible to integrate the scene within the newly emerged horizon of narrativization, historization, symbolization.
The way in which an event becomes the sort of negative core around which, like, it's the quilting point around which the future then takes its own shape. It's not unlike what Peter,
A time in which the event or the trauma can be symbolized.
And then and historicized as well. I think that, well, those two things imply one another. Just going back to Michael, did you have anything you wanted to say about that quote?
Well, no, like, I don't know, like the basic idea is that for the child, when he witnesses his parents fucking, he has no recourse. He has nothing available to him to interpret that event. It's just pure phenomena, right? And it's only later, as the child starts to develop more nuanced or sophisticated understandings about sexuality, that space, that symbolic space, starts to it shapes that event retroactively.
Yeah, to review.
Which is often why trauma is something that remains unmitigated and sort of like kerneled, for so long, right? That people don't in fact actually truly encounter, and they're fated to repeat until they, begin to, I think, enter into an analytical relationship, into a relationship in which there's a process and treatment where they can actually begin to historicize the event that has always already been kind of determining their activity and their processes and their way of even interpreting their own lives. It's funny, Will, just back to like the Proust versus, and I always think of Sebald, but like there's a difference for me between them, because Proust actually kind of pointedly, he actually does go into the finer grained details, and like whether or not it's fictionalized is up for grabs. But like with Sebald, I think the whole thing is that there are these because he's very much into how history is this repetition, and that there are these grand, like, super structural kind of forces that act upon the present, like sort of in an undisturbed way. They disturb, but like we are sort of unwittingly acting out these historical processes. And I think that's like why I'm bringing this up is that I think there's a real difference between remembering and repeating. The difference in temporality, as you've kind of tried to emphasize, I think twice now, is like, as a person who personally in analysis, like over many years, I have what I think is uncovered patterns that are articulable, right? And I'm able to say certainly in this kind of commonplace way, like, these are my, I don't use the word trauma, but like I feel as though I am acting out patterns. Now, the problem with that is that there's this kind of suspicious feeling where it's like, by articulating it, it means that I'm either kind of relinquished, like I'm sort of like giving up altogether, and that is just a pattern, or that it's not the thing. It's not the thing. It's the thing that I am in stand in. It's the pattern, is because I can speak it, represents a certain inability to incorporate the actual traumatic event, and that I'm kind of in acquiescing by history and by interpretation and by the symbolic order. I'm just sort of like, this is my best way of symbolizing the unsymbolizable. And I think that that's a huge problem, right? It's like, because the point is analysis never ends, right? At least the way that Freud understood analysis is that you're in analysis for your whole life. And like, to feel as though you've kind of, I'm like, oh, it's, I have this relationship with my overbearing mother, and thanks so much. Like, I see that now. I see how I can enact that. Yes.
What Zizek and so on.
And so on and so on.
So what, like, Zizek and other people in that constellation are getting at is that the mode of interpretation is a form of repetition, which produces which produces a relation between the analysand and their past as a trauma, and then it has to get interpreted through their particular individual relation to their symbolic network.
Maybe a basic sense, like reintegrating it into a symbolic order, into a
Yeah.
And like this is what working
a small
through is, right?
it's a chain of symbolic meaning. Yeah.
Did you say, Michael? Did you say interpretation is a mode of repetition?
Yeah, because when you are with your analyst and you're in the mode of free association, it's not that you remember something, it's that you repeat it. And what needs to be sort of like the focus needs to be on when you are repeating, it's not at all to do with the actual event itself in the past. It's a mode of interpretation, but that particular mode of interpretation is individual. So your analyst moves you through your associations.
So repeating is actually a mode of interpretation.
Yeah.
Brilliant. You're sort of offering it up in the current situation, in your current relationships, in your current,
and that's why it
relationship
comes
to
from the
analyst.
future.
Yes, son of a bitch.
Oh, I see. The future of the trauma, of the supposed trauma.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And that's why identifying with the trauma doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, because you can
as
only
if you yeah.
What was that sound?
As if you could like domesticate
another-
your trauma, like you'll put it on a leash, like walk, call it its name, trauma.
This is the thing,
it's
right?
now yours, right?
And people have a tendency, especially what Jake, you were saying earlier, made me think of this also in terms of like psychology, where there's like an essentialized notion of trauma, and it's like as if it becomes part of like a personality trait, where like modern psychology has made types of reactions to trauma one's personality, like you are a neurotic, or you are etc., rather than this mode. It's not that you can, like we're saying, like in some sense, practically speaking, trauma is essential, but not in its interpretation, not in its kind of positive constituents, but in its negativity.
Mm-hmm. So then there's a connection here, thinking philosophically about the relation between the subject and the past. Sorry, let me start that again. The relation of the patient subject to their past in Freud is, as we've been discussing, one where the trauma is repeated, etc. But there's another philosophical engagement with this, with man and the return of his past, and the possibilities and impossibilities of that. Might be interesting to discover here. Jake is holding up the book. Nietzsche's concept of eternal return of the same, or as we have sometimes called it, eternal return of my shame.
Eternal occurrence of our shame. Yeah. Me and Jake were sitting on the sidewalk in Toronto, and someone walked by who from our past, and I looked over to him and I said, "The eternal recurrence of our shame."
It was great.
Well, the eternal recurrence is an interesting, like, and I'm not sure if I should bring this up after we talk about that, but in terms of what Jake was talking about, in terms of like the end of analysis, the unending rather of analysis, Nietzsche has a really interesting concept of forgetfulness, where he talks about how like in order to live, we need to be able to forget.
Mm-hmm.
And like historically speaking, like there are clear links between Nietzsche and Freud. Like, there's plenty of suggestions that Freud comes out of the Nietzschean tradition in a certain sense. But just this little quote from Nietzsche here. It says, "Forgetfulness is not just via inertia as superficial as people believe, but it's rather an active ability to suppress, positive in the strongest sense of the word, to which we owe the fact that what we simply live through, experience, take in, no more enters our consciousness during digestion." And then ... from which we can immediately see how there can be no happiness, cheerfulness, hope, pride, immediacy without forgetfulness. The person in whom this apparatus of suppression is damaged so that it stops working can be compared, and not just compared, to a dyspeptic. He cannot cope with anything. Maybe this is completely opposite.
Well,
of what
no,
we're talking about,
it is
but
opposite, and it actually goes well into Zizek's point about the notion of eternal return, where he says that this concept, and the one that you just mentioned, I think, for Zizek, means that there is no longer a traumatic kernel resisting its recollection, that the subject can fully assume its past and project it into the future as willing its recurrence. But he points out.
I need that
like,
again. I need that. Can you just put that like differently one more time, or like in your own
That-
words?
In my own words, basically, Zizek is saying that Nietzsche is basically saying that there is no. I mean, in a way, there's kind of no unconscious, or there's no sort of thing in you that's acting against your positive affirmation of your life and of your potential,
Which would be death drive, wouldn't it be? Like how could you? It's like how could you eschew the death drive?
Yeah, exactly.
It's the thing that's basically it's the
I mean, the problem is that eternal recurrence is based on a notion of transcendence, of like of climbing the ladder or of crossing the bridge. And Nietzsche has that famous line, "Man is a bridge," or as Peter once said, "Man is abridged." Which I've always loved.
That's good.
Like what but it's very interesting because Zizek ventures this twist on that idea that man is a bridge, and I think it's actually similar to Freud's concept of working through that we've been talking about here. Zizek says this intermediate status of man is his greatness, since the human being is in its very essence a passage, the finite openness into an abyss. The subject is incomplete, but it's an ontological incompleteness, right? It's the ontological incompleteness can't be surpassed or overcome in Nietzsche's in these terms, right? So
yeah, there's Nietzsche does have a sense of kind of the abyss, right? He does have a sense of some sort of like hazy latency to our experiences, but a kind of proto sense of the unconscious maybe. But he does view it as to be overcome.
Yeah,
and that like
the working through pertains to this notion of the incompleteness of the subject, of the subject's relation to the traumatic core of its very being. It's not like fixing that, right? It's not an end point where man consciously assumes his destiny as the overman, but rather confronts the incompleteness of his subjecthood. And in this sense, working through can be understood as I think absolute knowledge which disintegrates at the moment of its culmination. Whenever you think of that.
cool.
Okay,
Cool.
Because wouldn't the eternal recurrence of the like isn't he sort of saying that like to live as though you didn't you're not in the process of remembering, you're in the process of repeating ad infinitum, right?
Yeah,
like,
and actively willing that repetition. Yeah,
that's right. You do away with memory because you are willing sorry, say that again, Will.
Well, it's like it's the repetition that's involved in the eternal recurrence of the same is to will the recurrence in all of its features.
I have the quote
That's
here
right.
from the Nietzsche, maybe here he says, look, if you had one opportunity, you had one chance, one opportunity, would you take it?
Your mom is spaghetti.
You better lose yourself in the music the moment you own it. Okay, he says your first, this is the heaviest burden. If a demon crept up to you one day or night, this is actually a quote. In your loneliest solitude and said to you, this life as you live it and have lived it, you will live again and again, times without number, and there will be nothing new in it. Every pain, every joy, every thought, and every sigh, and all the unspeakably small and great in your life must return to you, and everything in the same series and sequence. ... Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who thus spoke? Or have you experienced a tremendous moment in which you would have answered him, you're a god, and never did I hear anything more divine?
And actually, Zizek, I think, somewhat ingeniously points out that there is a kind of homology here with the last line of Hegel's encyclopedia. He says, the eternal idea in its full fruition of its essence eternally sets itself to work, engendering and enjoying itself as absolute spirit. And Hegel quote, Zizek continues, for an authentic philosopher, everything has already happened. What is difficult to grasp is how this notion not only does not prevent engaged activity, but effectively sustains it. And he goes on to cite a Jesuit axiom. Here then is the first rule of acting. Assume/believe that the success of your undertakings depends entirely on you and in no way on God, but nonetheless set to work as if God alone wills everything and you yourself nothing. And he continues here, you must experience yourself as fully responsible. The trust in God must be in your acts, not in your beliefs. While the common maxim involves the standard fetishist split of "I know very well that everything depends on me, but nonetheless I believe in God's helping hand," the Jesuit version is not a simple symmetrical reversal of the split. It rather thoroughly undermines the logic of fetishistic disavowal, which I think he's sort of blaming Nietzsche of that fetishistic disavowal, that the traumas of and the symptoms of that I'm doomed to repeat are ones rather that I fully know and see, will, and can overcome.
Though, I mean, maybe I'm misinterpreting here. I'm not entirely sure that's exactly what I think that's what Nietzsche's saying in terms of the concept of the like Übermensch, but in terms of eternal recurrence, he's saying that the repetition doesn't change. There isn't some sort of higher overcoming of it, but that the presence of that repetition is itself some sort of like
The overcoming.
yeah.
But I think the
Well,
overcoming of it is willing its repetition.
Yeah.
That's right.
Well, sure, yeah.
As the Jesuit sort of wills, wills despite despite sort of I don't even know if acknowledgement is the right word, but that God has already sort of willed that, that it's not their will at all.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That God has actually in a certain way determined what they are willing, but willing despite.
But this goes back to something we were talking about last time. It was a point that you were making, Peter, and there's a bit of a conversation between you and Jake about like freedom is accepting the in a sense kind of predetermined nature of the situation. Do you remember that?
Well, acting as if you're already fucked, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the catastrophe has already occurred.
It's that
Right.
that there's one interpretation of the big other that is that we are simply, we are like ventriloquized, right?
Yeah.
Right.
But and that in a certain way the break, I said that and I'm still unsure about this, but like that in the very slip, it's the person, in your control of language is where we feel as though we have power, but it's actually in our slip where we have a kind of incursion of true freedom, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is to acknowledge that there are points where we have no control, and where we have no control is the actual site of our, emancipatory freedom.
Exactly.
Not freedom to control and will and, be powerful and, articulate and whatever and manipulate language, but it's actually in those instantiating events that break the symbolic. They allow us to reshape and curve and determine, but only after, right? This is the Zizek'ian point, is that these traumatic events happen, and the way in which they're futured is that like we won't know until the cigarette after, sort of the way in which our trauma has in fact determined and cast forth sort of the subject who's willing to either kind of
accept their status as incomplete, like fundamentally, or try to overcome it and paper over that,
reincorporate the event. Yeah. Which would be like, that's the way the smooth running of the cat, like that's
exactly.
interesting.
Yeah.
Like not allowing for a new signifier to emerge and just sort of like reincorporating it in the hegemonic symbolic order, or allowing for the rupture to actually be,
or within the psyche itself, right? Like to sort of project an identity defined by that, and to say that either like this is a part of me, or I've just I've overcome that, or Jake, like you were talking about, this idea of psychoanalysis as a continual engagement with that fundamental condition,
which of course you pay for.
Anyway, I feel like
maybe more the heaviest financial burden.
Nice.
That's right.
But I feel like
Michael
derailed us there. I want to hear from Michael.
I know. I was like, Michael, you got something in there.
I sort of.
It's so unfair. You're the only, you're the only person I feel like we put on the spot. But I don't know. I think so what have we? I just want to say maybe make it clear, or just kick the football around a little more. Is why did you bring up Nietzsche? Like what is it? What purpose does Nietzsche serve here for us? Considering the three sort of temporalities and modalities that we talked about with Freud, what does Nietzsche present for us? Is it a stick in the mud, or is it something that we kind of, we work on?
I think we can test what we've been discussing about Freud against a different notion of the return of the past.
So would the distinction be the return of the past and the return of the repressed?
Oh yeah, that could be it. Yeah.
Holy. Yeah, I think that's I think that the overcoming is a really important thing there. So working through and overcoming to me are vastly different things.
Totally different. Yeah.
Just vastly different.
Zizek makes the link between trauma and Nietzsche in On Belief.
I think that the point that Zizek is making about Nietzsche fundamentally is that Nietzsche is opting for a fetishistic disavowal of repetition and of kind of symptoms and trauma.
Yeah, well, okay, yeah. Zizek makes the direct comparison in On Belief, where he writes, "It is precisely with historical traumas like the Holocaust which seem to posit a limit to such a Nietzschean vision. For Nietzsche, if we do not radicalize the will to power into eternal recurrence of the same, the assertion of our will remains incomplete. We forever remain constrained by the inertia of the past, which we did not choose or will, and which, as such, limits the scope of our free assertion. Only the eternal recurrence of the same changes every it was into it will be, apropos of which I can then say I willed it thus." And he says there's an inherent link between the notions of trauma and repetition, signaled in Freud's well-known motto that what one is not able to remember, one is condemned to repeat. Trauma is by definition something which one is not able to remember.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. Yeah, that's perfect.
Sorry, that was kind of a long quote, but I think that's kind of what we're getting at with the connection of that Zizek is making between Nietzsche and Freud there.
And it's like the claim that a lot of people have about Hegel is that he's attempting at this kind of like monomaniacal, grand, full, complete, total knowing, right? But the point that Zizek and Todd make about Hegel is that like it's at that very moment that it disintegrates, that absolute knowing disintegrates, that spirit disintegrates.
I think we're basically good.
Where do we go from here? I don't mean topic wise. I mean, like, I'm obviously sizing up the fact that I have therapy in 45 minutes, but
I think that's basically what he's like. I don't think necessarily like every concept that we're discussing has to come to some sort of synthesis, and we have to figure out like what the solution to it is.
Yeah, right.
Because talking about memory and trauma, I think we did that.
I got a Todd McGowan quote that we can end on.
Sounds good.
In regards to temporality, which I think we've been covering over the episode, a child doesn't understand the first introduction of sexuality by the other as being sexual in nature, and thus fails to register the trauma of the encounter. But after the fact, sometime years later, a similar encounter will reactivate the earlier trauma and retroactively reveal its traumatic dimension. Freud labels this process of delayed or retroactive action Nachträglichkeit. The power of Nachträglichkeit suggests that living in the present involves simultaneously living in the past. Past traumas are not past because they are not often yet trauma, and they require a present revelation to activate them.
Yeah, and that's something that's been looming here, this notion of retroactivity, which should get its own episode, I think. But yeah, that's so kind of against our conventional notion of what trauma is, right?
Yeah, it's the inverse.
It's the inverse of it.
Yeah.
What if it was the exact opposite, you could say?
What if it was precisely whatever
Precisely.
Yeah.
What if
the reversal was precisely true? Yeah.
I think that's a good place to leave it, fellas. Nice talking to you. Zizek and so on. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Talk again soon.
I guess.
And so on and so on. And so on and so on. And so on and so on.